Born into a family of peasants, his humble childhood seemed to chart a common destiny. He didn't even finish basic education, but that didn't stop him from shaping his name as one of the most feared leaders in the Middle East, and perhaps the world. Saddam Hussein seized power in Iraq in 1979, establishing a regime where his presence was absolute. His face was on every corner, emblazoned on buildings as a constant reminder that he was the law and any opposition would be crushed. His path was marked by ambition and violence. He orchestrated attacks on Iran, ordered the invasion of Kuwait, and started the Gulf War, leaving a trail of destruction. Under accusations of crimes against humanity, his leadership became unsustainable in the eyes of the West, which decided to intervene. The ultimatum came directly and without hesitation. Saddam Hussein and his sons must leave Iraq within 48 hours or face the consequences. But for a man like Saddam, the word surrender did not exist. In 2003, while Saddam ignored President Bush's warnings, something began to stir in the shadows. An operation was underway, a hunt that promised to be relentless, and Saddam's fate was heading toward an inevitable confrontation. As Iraq became the stage for a global conflict, forces prepared for a maneuver that would change everything. If you want to understand all the details about the U.S. intervention in Iraq and the events surrounding the capture of one of the most sought-after targets, get ready to dive into a story full of twists and turns. Let's begin by learning more about the man who became the focus of this mission, Saddam Hussein. Saddam was born in a small Iraqi village called Al-Auja on April 28, 1937. From the beginning, his life was marked by tragedy. Even before he was born, his father and brother died from a disease, leaving his mother pregnant, depressed, and alone. Desperate, she attempted an abortion and even tried to take her own life, but neither attempt succeeded. In the end, she gave birth to Saddam, and over time she remarried. Unfortunately, the new marriage brought even more challenges for Saddam. His stepfather was violent and frequently abused him, making his childhood extremely difficult. This situation led him to leave his family home at just 10 years old, in search of a different life in the capital, Baghdad. Once in the city, Saddam faced difficulties in studying, but this did not demotivate him. In 1950, he found a new purpose when he joined a political party called Ba'ath. This organization based its ideas on Arab nationalism and gave him a sense of direction amid the chaos of his youth. In a world where ideology fuels action and the desire to unify people under a common flag blends with personal ambitions, Saddam Hussein, young and full of political fervor, found in the Ba'ath Party the foundation of his worldview. The belief that Arab peoples, united by cultural and historical roots, should form one nation guided many of his steps, leading him to decisions that would forever change the course of his life. It was in 1959 that Saddam became part of an audacious conspiracy, the assassination of then Iraqi Prime Minister Abdul Karim Qasim. However, the plan was a disaster. Forced to flee for his life, he crossed the desert to reach Egypt. This period of exile seemed at first like a defeat, but it actually planted the seeds of an inevitable return. 4 years later, Saddam returned to Iraq. However, this return was marked by imprisonment, a period in which he would await his chance to shift the balance of power. That opportunity finally came in 1968, when the Ba'ath Party took control of the government. It marked the starting point for Saddam's relentless rise, which, in just a decade, would see him reach the peak of his ambitions when he officially assumed the presidency of Iraq in 1979. With absolute power in hand, Saddam not only consolidated his government, but began shaping his image as a leader who would never bow. His regime became synonymous with oppression, but also with an aggressive strategy, Attacks on Iran marked the beginning of a conflict that drained Iraq's resources and created deep crises. As the country's finances began to crumble, Saddam turned his eyes to Kuwait, seeing the oil wealth of that territory as a solution. The invasion, however, brought consequences that he could never have predicted. But what really led Saddam to believe he could control the consequences of such a risky move? And how would the world react to this offensive that would change the global geopolitical balance? In the silent dawn of a shattered Iraq, helicopters sliced through the sky like winged shadows, carrying a mission as secretive as it was decisive. The operation, codenamed Red Dawn, was the culmination of a hunt that had lasted for months. Soldiers moved with precision, crossing deserts and villages, tracking every lead, every rumor. The question was no longer if Saddam would be foe. Weapons, documents, and evidence that Saddam had passed through the location. However, the main target was still not found. It was then that the soldiers noticed something peculiar. A small styrofoam lid covered in dirt and vegetation. Upon removing it, they revealed a narrow and dark tunnel known as a spider hole. Inside, hidden, was Saddam Hussein. Unarmed and filthy, the former dictator appeared exhausted and dejected. His capture was marked by an iconic moment. When the soldiers illuminated him with flashlights and called him out, Saddam offered no resistance. His words were, "I am Saddam Hussein, the president of Iraq, and I am ready to negotiate." But there would be no negotiation. He was immediately detained and transported to a secure location. The impact of the capture. The news of Saddam's capture was met with relief by many and disbelief by others. His weakened state and appearance, far from the imposing figure that once dominated the palaces of Baghdad, showed the world a dictator, reduced to an ordinary man. However, his arrest did not bring an immediate end to the violence in Iraq, but it was an important milestone in the attempt to stabilize the country. Meanwhile, the dictator, once mighty, had been reduced to countless escapes. His palaces, which once gleamed as symbols of power, were either empty or destroyed. The hunt had forced Saddam to abandon everything, his glory, his wealth, even his security. Hidden in holes in the ground, using rudimentary disguises, he became a shadow of the man who had once ruled the Middle East. The pressure was relentless. Each day brought news of captures and desertions, of allies turning against him or simply disappearing. Still, the task force knew that, to capture the man who had defied the world for so long, more would be needed. Patience, strategy, and flawless execution. When the moment finally arrived, the soldiers surrounded the location with surgical precision. The hideout, a small makeshift structure, was searched until, under layers of dirt and debris, they found him. Saddam Hussein was there, unarmed, defeated, but still with a focused gaze, maintaining a remnant of his old arrogance. But as the world witnessed the end of an era, another question began to linger in the air, a doubt that would haunt the coming decades. What would happen to Iraq now, without its tyrant, but still scarred by the wounds he left? The capture of Saddam Hussein marked the end of an unrelenting pursuit, but it didn't bring the sense of closure many had expected. As images of the former dictator, disoriented and unrecognizable, were broadcast worldwide, the streets of Iraq remained unsettled. For some, it was the end of a nightmare. For others, the beginning of a dangerous void. The man who had ruled with an iron fist was off the stage, but the ruins of his regime still weighed heavily on the nation. In the days following his capture, Saddam became a prisoner of the people who had once feared him. His arrogance, even in defeat, was unmistakable. During interrogations, he refused to admit any mistakes or weaknesses, insisting on narratives that portrayed him as a misunderstood leader. But the charges against him spoke louder: genocides, brutal repression, and wars that devastated the Middle East. As the world watched this conclusion, the winds of change began to blow in Iraq, but not in the way many had imagined. Saddam's absence created a power vacuum that quickly turned into a battlefield for various factions. Groups once marginalized saw an opportunity for ascension, while foreign forces fought to stabilize the country. Chaos was inevitable, but there was something even deeper. The wounds left by years of oppression and fear don't heal overnight. The people, divided between hope and uncertainty, questioned the future of an Iraq without its leader, but also without direction. Saddam's arrest was a symbol, but symbols alone were not enough to rebuild a nation. And as the courts prepared to try Saddam Hussein for his crimes, a new battle was brewing, not in the battlefields, but in the hearts and minds of a people who were desperately seeking a path to peace. In the months following Saddam Hussein's capture, Iraq became a powder keg on the verge of explosion. The absence of the dictator did not bring the expected stability, but instead a whirlwind of chaos and violence. Rival factions, divided by ethnicity, religion, and political interests, began fighting for power in a fragmented territory. Sunnis, Shiites, and Kurds, once united only by the fear imposed by the regime, were now facing each other in a brutal struggle for influence and control. Meanwhile, Saddam awaited his trial in a solitary cell, surrounded by guards, but in some ways still maintaining the defiant gaze of someone who considered himself invincible. For some, he was not just a prisoner. He was a symbol of a past many wanted to erase, but one that continued to shape the present, even behind B. But as Saddam Hussein's body was buried, one question continued to echo in Iraq and around the world. Who would truly inherit the future of a devastated nation? Among the ruins of the regime and the incessant conflicts, Iraq's fate remained as uncertain as it had been on the first day of the invasion. After Saddam Hussein's execution, Iraq plunged even deeper into chaos. The power vacuum he left became fertile ground for the rise of new forces, many of them even more unpredictable and fragmented. Local militias turned cities into fortresses, while extremist groups emerged with agendas that extended beyond Iraq's borders. Among them, one name began to gain prominence, something that initially seemed just another insurgency: the Islamic State. Meanwhile, the population tried to survive, the daily life marked by instability. The streets of Baghdad, once vibrant, had turned into arenas of explosions and checkpoints. Entire families, displaced by the war, wandered in search of safety that seemed to slip further away. The promise of a reconstructed Iraq, made by foreign leaders, increasingly sounded like a distant echo. At the same time, a new political class emerged from the ashes of the old regime. Figures who had once opposed Saddam now held positions of power, but they were unable to unite the fragmented country. Corruption and internal rivalries further weakened the central government, which struggled to maintain any semblance of control. In the northern regions, the Kurds took bold steps toward autonomy, while in the south, tensions between Shiites and Sunnis erupted into clashes that threatened to permanently divide the country. And then, amid all this chaos, the international scene began to shift. The involvement of foreign forces became increasingly controversial. The human and financial cost of the occupation began to weigh heavily, and political pressures for a withdrawal increased. However, leaving Iraq to its own devices meant risking the emergence of new tyrants or extremist groups taking control. For the Iraqi people, Saddam's fall brought freedom, but also the weight of an uncertain future. The memories of the regime were painful, but many began to question whether the price of change had been too high. What was harder, living under the absolute control of a dictator or facing the chaos of an unplanned freedom? As the world watched Iraq's slow transformation, one thing became clear: The seeds planted during Saddam's regime would continue to grow in unexpected and unpredictable forms. And in the shadows of a nation in reconstruction, the fate of the Middle East remained at stake. The years following Saddam Hussein's fall brought more questions than answers. Iraq, once held under the weight of an authoritarian regime, was now a mosaic of conflicting interests, where alliances shifted as rapidly as the sandstorms that swept through the desert. In the vacuum left by the old dictatorship, not only did internal factions rise, but global and regional powers also entered the fray, each with their own agenda. The United States, which had led the invasion, faced growing pressure to withdraw. Its troops, however, the cost of leaving seemed as high as the cost of staying. The occupation had already eroded its international credibility, and the rising insurgency, which turned roads into minefields and markets into targets for attacks, made it harder every day to justify its presence. On the other hand, withdrawing meant leaving Iraq at the mercy of forces that could transform the country into something even more dangerous. Meanwhile, Iran watched closely, with a keen and calculating eye. With Saddam gone to contain it, the Sabah country expanded its influence among Iraqi Shiites, shaping local politics and funding militias that served as extensions of its power. This move sparked concerns. Concerns from other nations in the region, especially Saudi Arabia, viewed the strengthening of Iran as a direct threat to its leadership position in the Middle East. At the heart of this turmoil, the Iraqi population continued to pay the highest price. Cities like Baghdad, Fallujah, and Mosul became stages for daily violence. Explosions, armed confrontations, and sectarian attacks became part of the routine. Closed schools, overcrowded hospitals, and thousands of internally displaced people painted a picture of a country that, despite being free from Saddam's regime, was still far from finding peace. It was in this chaotic scenario that ISIS gained strength. Born from fragments of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, the group found fertile ground in a society marked by distrust and division. Promising order amidst the chaos, but bringing with it unimaginable brutality, they quickly became a dominant force, conquering territories, establishing a regime of terror, and drawing global attention. Iraq became the stage for a new battle, this time against an enemy without borders, one that didn't use tanks or national flags, but radical ideology. However, amidst this grim scenario, something began to change. A generation that grew up among the rubble started to raise its head. Young people who had never known a peaceful Iraq decided it was time to fight not with weapons, but with ideas, education, and innovation. Civil movements emerged in cities like Baghdad and Basra, calling for a less corrupt and more inclusive government, while artists, writers, and activists began to use their voices to reimagine what it meant to be Iraqi. But the journey to reconstruction is never linear. Iraq, marked by so many cycles of hope and frustration, remains at a crossroads. The future depends on those who believe that even in the heart of chaos, it's possible to plant the seeds of a new beginning. And now, amidst the ashes of a devastating past and the first glimpses of an uncertain future, the question remains: what will it take to turn pain into resilience and conflict into unity?